Nice. Yeah, it's always interesting when we look at different ends of the continuum. We talk about, elite sport, professional sport, and then down to our recreational and folks just trying to get started. Because when you use language like I'm only running 5 days a week, obviously in that elite continuum, they're like, oh, it's only
Mhm.
5 days. And then the rest of the folks thinking, geez, 5 days is still, a heck of a lot of running. Can you talk to us a bit about the intensity then of some of the runs within that 5 day block? Like how do you map that out in terms of being able to continue to progress?
Yeah, I mentioned so 1 day per week is always sort of a higher intensity workout. Typically, I'll alternate between some sort of threshold or tempo workout, longer duration, maybe 20 to like 60 minutes of like tempo running. And then another week I'll do intervals where you're kind of starting and stopping, maybe running shorter. So half mile, quarter mile, even mile repeats, kilometer repeats, something like that. I tend to alternate that just because it gives me a little bit of a novelty thing, and
Yeah.
I don't like doing the same thing week after week. Because I am self-coached, which is good in terms of I can do what I want, bad in terms of I can do what I
You could
want.
do what you want. Yeah,
It's
I was gonna
kind of a
say that's
double-edged sword. Feel like I have enough knowledge of myself that I'm able to do that successfully. But so that 1 day is intense, and because I'm only running 5 days a week, I wouldn't necessarily say any of my runs are maybe one run per week, but none of my runs are specifically I'm going out and trying to go as easy as possible. That's
Mhm.
typically reserved for those two cross training days. So when I'm on the
Gotcha.
bike, I'm pretty much just going pretty easy. I mean, one, it's low impact, so it's easy by necessity.
Yeah, low
But in terms of my
CNS.
heart rate, keeping heart rate intact, the nervous system stuff, biomechanical stuff, those are the easy days. So when I go out for a run, this is hardly a physiological term, but I'm sort of sometimes going on vibes. Just, how do I feel
Yeah.
this day? If I go out for a long run, say I'm going 20 miles, maybe going on a 2 hour long run, if I feel good that day, legs are feeling poppy, feeling pretty fresh, I might pick up the pace a little bit and run, at 80% of like my max or something like that, or end with a few hard miles. So one programmed speed workout, I typically then will reserve 2 days that week for, I'm going to pick it up a little bit if I feel good. And then the other two runs, I mean, they're going to be zone two runs, but probably the higher end of zone two. But if you looked at my heart rate distribution, honestly, and if you pulled up my app with my wearable, the watch that I use, and looked at the distribution, a lot of it is just in zone two heart rate, even if it may not be deliberately trying to run in that. So it typically ends up being honestly like a 85-15 distribution. 85% is just lower intensity zone two, 15% kind of higher intensity, and maybe like 2 to 5% in that really, really kind of harder intensity. So it's definitely still a polarized approach in terms of intensity, but because I'm running 5 days and cycling two, I don't necessarily feel that guilt of, oh, I didn't, run two of my runs this week like super, super easy.
Yeah.
I get that recovery on the bike, and that's how I feel.
It's interesting when we circle back to obviously using data and metrics versus subjective metrics, especially the more complex things get. There's so much more ambiguity and uncertainty. And it's amazing how the brain, after a certain point of doing a certain thing, whether it's the coach's eye in professional sport or, the runner's vibes, when you've been doing it long enough to kind of feel that out. So just curious how you think about it for yourself or people at that, recreational elite level of, the data coming from a wearable versus yeah, just how you feel guiding things, whether it's, week to week or month to month. How does that break down for you?
Data are obviously great. I love data. I love looking at my data, but I think this applies not only to sort of recreationally amateurs, elites, but also sort of even the general population, perhaps even more so the general population, where I sometimes think we can be a little bit too data obsessed, especially when it comes to metrics like heart rate. Because as you probably know, just working with athletes across the board, like something like heart rate and heart rate variability, those things can fluctuate so wildly depending on, yes, kind of your training status, but your stress, your outside stress. And so this is why I think it applies more to the general population than elite athletes who sometimes live in this bubble where training is the only stress in their lives. But
Yeah,
for
exactly.
people like me who are trying to train at a high level, but also full-time job, wife, kid. So you have all these additional stressors.
It's a game
So
changer when you got to worry about sleeping at night
it
and
for sure is. And we don't often think about that. We're like, man, why was my training session so bad today? It's like, well, yesterday you did your, 2 hour workout in the morning and then you worked all day and you didn't get good sleep at night. It's all of these stresses playing in. But all of that is to just say all of those things can feed into how your heart rate responds in any particular day. And so I think sometimes runners and athletes can get really wrapped up in that and like just hyper focused on what does this heart rate mean this day? Am I overtraining? Am I pushing too hard? Whereas I like RPE a lot for the reason that
Yeah.
it's really valuable. And I think one of the misconceptions about RPE is that it's just this subjective measure. Oh, I think I'm at like a 6 or a 7 out of 10. When in reality, I think it's a very physiological and like biologically based measure because the brain is not stupid. It's informing all of our decisions and it's getting feedback from our muscles, it's getting feedback from our heart, it's getting feedback from hormones and compounds, molecules in our body. And that's what's going into informing our RPE. It's not just like a guess. If
Yeah.
you ask me how hard this run feels, I'm not just guessing. I'm getting these signals from my body and using that to inform it. So I think it can be more valuable as long as if you kind of are in tune with your body and have trained for a decent period of time, I think it can be a really valuable metric and it corresponds pretty well to say, if you're running in zone two or zone three or zone four.
Yeah, it's certainly, as athletes progress, it's a really nice tool to use, especially, with when you start work coaching with potentially endurance athletes that are just general public of getting into that habit of reflecting on things, whether it's reflecting during the session, whether it's weekly reflection, but getting them to think more about what's going on in terms of their internal physiology as you're, you know, talking about here, whether it's the intensity of the session, whether it was the sleep the night before, the fueling, you start to think about these things versus just sort of outsourcing all that to a number on your watch, which again can be helpful for certain periods of time. But the marriage between those two is always interesting. Ed, Steve Magnus was on the podcast there earlier this
Mm.
year, and kind of talking about this. Of it could certainly be helpful at times, but to your point, there's times when we just need to actually see what the athlete thinks, and that intuition can really pay off in terms of really accurately predicting things like the RPE based on the physiology. As we're talking about kind of this recreational elite level, if we pivot to nutrition, right? What are some of the fueling strategies you're using to help, your pursuit to cut those 8 minutes off, or what you're seeing in the research?
Yeah, I've made a lot of changes because, as you're also probably well aware of, like the bone stress injuries and stuff, a lot of that comes down to training, but a lot of it comes down to the other side of the equation, which is nutrition. And
Yeah.
one of the biggest changes I made is, yes, of course, like making sure I get enough protein, which is typically not a problem. Focusing kind of on the carb intake at meals rather than protein, because I know protein is going to get there, but what I struggle with is maybe consuming enough carbohydrate.